Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. We are at the United Nations in New York. I'm Daniel Hoffman, and today's guest is Louise Arbour, the Canadian lawyer and prosecutor. Thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
You have held several high-ranking positions at the UN throughout your career. You are a former commissioner for human rights. You also were the chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And in March of last year, Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed you as his special representative for international migration. Can you tell us what your mission consists of?
In September of 2016, in a document called the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, member states of the United Nations undertook to launch a process towards the adoption of what is called a global compact on migration. There's also a process for a global compact on refugees, but that's very different process. This global compact on migration is an initiative of member states, and it's a document that they will negotiate. And one hopes that will adopt at the end of this year, 2018, in Morocco, in an international intergovernmental conference on migration at the head of state, head of government level. So it's a wonderful initiative of member states, and the Secretary General appointed me essentially to mobilize the resources of the UN Secretariat, the various agencies that have competence on these kinds of issues, to accompany, to support the process of member states. So it's in that spirit that today the Secretary General released his report, Making Migration Work for All, in a sense to accompany and inform the thinking of the member states who will present to each other what is called a zero draft, the basic draft of this document that they will then negotiate in the months ahead.
This global compact will be partially based on the 2016 New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. Just a month ago, the United States decided to withdraw from this New York Declaration. The argument was that it's harming its national sovereignty. Can this global compact be taken seriously without the support of the United States?
Well, it's taken very seriously by all the other members of the United Nations who are very engaged, have been very engaged in consultations, and frankly, every one of them, as far as I could tell, is very conscious that this document will in no way infringe on their state sovereignty. State sovereignty is still the governing principle. All member states understand at the outset of these negotiations that they have the right, prerogative, and responsibility to control their borders, to decide who enters their territory, for what reason, under what terms, for what length of time, and so on. They also understand, though, that state sovereignty is one thing, but on an issue in which, when a human being crosses a border, inevitably it engages the interest of more than one state. And therefore, they now view, in light of a lot of recent events, the necessity to enhance a variety of ways in which they can better cooperate to reap the benefits of migration, which are numerous, and to minimize the challenges that it poses. So far, everybody is very engaged, and I think very enthusiastic about the idea of enacting this global compact.
But are you expecting a U.S. re-engagement in the New York Declaration?
I hope that the United States, first of all, will follow the process, even though they said they will not participate formally in the negotiations. And I really hope that at the end of the day, they will see in the compact itself, which, let me stress, is not meant to be a legally binding document. They're not negotiating a treaty in which they would bind themselves and monitor their performance and so on. All member states understand that what they're trying to reach are better frameworks and agreement to enhance their understanding of each other, their cooperation for the kind of win-win-win outcome. A win for countries of origin, a win for countries of destination, and a win for the 250 million migrants in the world today and the many million more that we will see in decades ahead.
Over the course of the past few months and years, there has been a rise of the populist and nationalist sentiment in Western Europe and in the United States, with parties coming to power or rising with a strong anti-migrant platform. Isn't that a proof, or doesn't that show that migration is seen in many of these countries as primarily a threat, but not as an opportunity?
In fact, I think there is a real challenge in confronting a perception that is at times completely hostile to this entire enterprise. This is the reality. The more optimistic view is that this perception is demonstrably misguided, and the actual reality, an evidence-based approach to migration, yields a very different picture. Not one that is not without challenges, but one that is overwhelmingly a much, much more positive story. We don't have a lot of time. This process will be negotiated in the next 6 months. The Global Compact is to be adopted by the end of this year. And so there's no doubt it's going to take considerable political leadership and therefore political courage for decision makers to push back against mythology, stereotypes, negative attitudes that are completely disconnected, not only from reality, but from the very best interest of a lot of these people whose attitude today makes them walk into a wall. This kind of negative attitude towards migration, for instance, in many Western countries, in the short to medium term is going to be completely self-defeating. The Western world is going to face demographic deficits that are such that Europeans, North Americans will not be able to maintain their standard of living unless they can import part of their workforce at all skill levels, highly skilled and lower skilled workers in the care industry, not only in the technological industry, in agriculture. So to better manage that is in everybody's interest, rather than to continue, in a sense, to tolerate, if not encourage, a lot of irregular migration that feeds into the informal economy, make government appear not to have control of their borders, and then fuel even more negative stereotypes.
There has been no shortage of migrant crisis in 2017 in Libya, in Syria, in Myanmar. Many have criticized the slow and sometimes limited response of the international community. What can be done to improve the UN response in these situations?
Well, for one thing, I think it's really important to distinguish the characters of these various crises. Some, I think, that can genuinely qualify as crisis. Others that I think in the grand scheme of things could have been managed in a way that would not have been so intensely an acute crisis situation. In some of the cases that you've mentioned, in the case of Myanmar and the Rohingya population, which is now overwhelmingly concentrated in Bangladesh, you're talking about clearly a population of refugees. That is, people fleeing persecution, fear of persecution in the context of conflict, which is very different from, for instance, the population that was coming from sub-Saharan Africa through Libya into the Mediterranean, where, for the most part, many of these prospective migrants are not refugees, not necessarily fleeing persecution, but very often finding themselves in pretty well identical situation as refugees. That is, poor people leaving behind quite desperate situations, sometimes environmental degradation, bad governance, lack of opportunities, lack of any future for themselves, their families, but who, in contrast to refugees, don't have currently a lot of international entitlements to protection and very few adequate open legal pathways to access the work that, frankly, in a lot of cases is awaiting them in Europe, in washing dishes in restaurants and working in all kinds of other sectors of the informal economy. This is what now would benefit immensely from better international management.
I want to ask a question to the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. You formally indicted then Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic. Now this tribunal has dissolved after more than 24 years of existence. How would you judge its efficacy?
You know, I've worked in the criminal justice system both nationally and internationally for a large part of my career. And when I look at where national justice systems are at and the centuries that it took to bring them there, it puts into perspective how the complexity of the first ever international attempt to use international criminal justice as a tool of peace and reconciliation. Maybe we were way too ambitious in thinking that we could just put all that into place very rapidly at modest cost and reap all its benefits. I think that the legacy of these tribunals, the existence of the International Criminal Court is one of them, is fundamentally a profound rejection of the culture of impunity through which leaders, political, military leaders, and otherwise powerful people had benefited from for years and years. I think that chapter is over. How the configuration of accountability, what shape it's going to take in the future, I think there's still lots of options, and I can't predict the future. But I think the real legacy is a rejection of the impunity of the all-powerful.
Louise Arbour, Special Representative for International Migration, thank you very much. And thank you very much for watching the show. Stay tuned on France 24 for more news.
My name's Thomas Lowe and I'm France 24's correspondent here in Moscow, a city that's become once more a geopolitical capital. I cover Russia and the former Soviet Union, and you can find me on news and TV shows here on France 24.
Thomas Lowe, one of the 160 France 24